Hi, and welcome to this podcast from 1914 to 1918war.com. In this episode, I'm going to be getting into the origins of the First World War and how the war broke out. It's a long subject with huge amounts of literature, so I'm kind of regretting getting into this, but let's give it a go. As always, make sure that you've subscribed to the podcast so that you don't miss any future episodes, and sit back and enjoy Outbreak.
Everything you hold worthwhile is at stake.
Nur durch starke Berührung mit der See können wir den für uns nötigen weltumspannenden Geistgenot von Gewinn.
Look, that French girl, give me this bunch of flowers. Mercy, man, Billy.
The 1815 Congress of Vienna established what came to be known as the Concert of Europe. This settlement was intended by the European powers to keep the lids on the forms of nationalism that had caused the series of European wars between 1792 and 1815. However, whilst there were indeed less of the major European and mainly French-led wars, the Concert of Europe was less effective in the Balkans, where the small new states of Serbia, Montenegro and Romania depended on the patronage of the larger Russia and Austro-Hungary for their survival. Austro-Hungary was a messy amalgam of 11 different ethnic groupings, with often conflicting interests, many of which included significant populations living outside of their mother country. For example, Austria was primarily populated with ethnic Germans. In 1908, Austro-Hungary had annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina. This action had alienated Russia, who felt protective to the Slavic populations of the Balkans. In addition, due to the presence of Serbs and Croats who lived in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the annexation led to calls for these people to be governed by Serbia, where Serbs and Croats formed the dominant political power. In 1912 and 1913, Serbia had fought two wars of expansion that had taken both territory and population from Austro-Hungary, and in both cases, the Concert of Europe had failed to broker an agreement. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, was acutely aware of the need for an alliance with another regional power to buttress his empire. Romania was a good match, with an army that was significantly larger than Austro-Hungary's. However, there was a fly in the ointment where a continuing dispute over the Transylvanian region, where the Magyars ruled over ethnic Romanians, rumbled on. Rejecting any reforms, the Magyars were an immovable obstruction to resolving the issue, and as Franz Ferdinand strove to keep Austro-Hungary together, were bound to be net losers in any concessions needed to placate other groups, most notably the Serbs, Bosnians and Croats. Widely seen as a reformer, Franz Ferdinand became a target for assassination as disaffected groups believed that his removal would prevent the implementation of the reforms that they feared. In the absence of being able to broker an agreement with Romania and fearful of triggering an intervention from Russia in the event of a Balkan conflict, Ferdinand requested a guarantee of support from the Germans, but this wasn't forthcoming. Casting about for alternatives to Romania, the next most likely option was Bulgaria. Able to exert pressure on Serbia via its shared border, it was also able to protect against any Russian advance. Accordingly, Austro-Hungary began to woo this new potential bride. In order to help bring about the union, the Austro-Hungarian foreign minister, Franz von Macheco, committed his thoughts to a letter that made the case for an alliance to both Franz Ferdinand and to the Germans whose financial strength would be required to bankroll an alliance. On June the 28th, the Archduke and his wife made a planned visit to Sarajevo. This was an important national day, and the visit could have been seen as inflammatory. In addition, security was lax, and quite frankly, they were asking for trouble. In an absence of any secrecy about the visit and its itinerary, a group of students calling themselves the Young Bosnians, who were advocates of expansionist Greater Serbian principles, planned to assassinate the Archduke. Their assassination attempt, positioning 7 assassins along the main route of the Archduke's cavalcade, failed when most of the assassins lost their nerve, and when a bomb thrown at the Archduke's car rolled under another car. However, by one of those quirks of fate upon which history can turn, later on in the day, the Archduke's car took a wrong turn and passed by one of the students. Gavrilo Princip took the opportunity presented to him and shot both the Archduke and his wife. They were pronounced dead just after 11 a.m. Princip, as an ethnic Bosnian coming from a Bosnian pressure group, drew suspicion onto the Serbians, as it was widely and correctly assumed that they had been sponsored by the Serbian authorities. The Serbian Prime Minister Pasic, caught between a strong and hawkish military which had sponsored the young Bosnians and the need to mollify international opinion, failed to condemn the assassination strongly enough, leaving a suspicion that it had indeed been a Serbian plot. And it had been. Serbian military leaders had provided the weapons and safe passage into Sarajevo for the assassins. Maciejko proposed to the ageing Emperor Franz Joseph that it was time for a final and fundamental reckoning with Serbia. This view concurred with that of the Austro-Hungarian Chief of Staff, Franz Conrad von Hötzendorf. It was his belief that Serbia had to be neutralised as a threat and as soon as possible. Von Hötzendorf, a man with Clausewitzian beliefs, had been kept in check by Franz Ferdinand and Maciejko, but now found that his hawkish opinions were pushing at an open door. His desire for personal glory and belief that the odds on an Austro-Hungarian victory against Serbia reduced the longer that a potential war was postponed, led him to the conclusion that she would be better off fighting now rather than when Serbia was stronger. Accordingly, the Austro-Hungarian government rapidly developed a new policy position that a war with Serbia was both inevitable and preferable. However, any war against Serbia carried the massive risk of Russian intervention. It was this risk that the Austro-Hungarians now sought to counter. Conrad's belief that Austro-Hungary could struggle in any war was grounded on the twin pillars of European military strength: manpower and firepower. In both these areas, Austro-Hungary lagged behind its local rivals and other European powers, lacking frontline troops, reserves and modern artillery in the quantities required. Austro-Hungary found itself in a position where it was unable to rearm quickly enough for the new challenges of 1914. Put simply, Austro-Hungary was incapable of fighting a war in the Balkans, whilst also defending itself from other powers that might get involved. The answer to this weakness was a military alliance with Germany. An alliance would protect Austro-Hungary from Russia and would lend weight to her efforts to bring Bulgaria into an alliance. Kaiser Wilhelm, fired up with anger over the loss of his friend, Franz Ferdinand, called his ministers together and rapidly agreed to support Austro-Hungary in the event of Russia's intervention in the Balkans. What Austro-Hungary decided to do with Serbia was very much left for her to decide. On the 6th of July, the German High Command's decision was communicated to Austro-Hungary, giving her freedom of manoeuvre and a seemingly unlimited guarantee of support. As Austro-Hungary and Germany forged closer links, it's opportune to consider the other great European alliance, the Triple Entente. The Entente was made up from seemingly incompatible countries: Great Britain, France and Russia. Britain and France were traditional enemies. Russia was an autocratic monarchy in contrast to France's republic, and Britain and Russian interests often conflicted in Asia due to the presence of Britain's Indian Empire. It was hard to imagine them as instinctive bedfellows. However, these countries had by 1914 made various bilateral agreements that bound them together. The German High Command looked at the apparent contradictions within the Entente and concluded that such a brittle alliance could and would be ruptured if placed under any kind of strain. Germany calculated that in the event of a war breaking out between Austro-Hungary and Serbia, either Russia would not fight because it wasn't ready to do so, or if it did, it would be ineffective. Crucially, Germany calculated that Russia would not be supported by France and Great Britain. German fears of growing Russian strength — she was already embarked upon a major rearmament programme — meant that, like Austro-Hungary, Germany too had an incentive for a preemptive war, and therefore would not see a military outcome as a disaster, should that unlikely scenario play out of any crisis in the Balkans. Accordingly, Germany made assurances to support Austro-Hungary. Whilst there were attempts to localise the crisis to Austro-Hungary and Serbia, and whilst not expecting to fight, Germany did not fear an encounter with Russia. The German leaders reasoned that Russia shouldn't want a war because they were militarily unprepared, and because politically there was no moral imperative to support Serbia. After all, Serbia had sponsored the assassinations. It therefore followed that if Russia chose to go to war, they must have been using the crisis as a pretense for military action, and in the face of such aggression, Germany would have no choice but to defend herself. Within the Austro-Hungarian government itself, opinion moved in favour of a strike against Serbia, overcoming Hungarian concerns rooted in internal ethnic considerations. On the 23rd of July, an ultimatum was delivered to the Serbian government demanding three main actions: that the Serbians round up terrorist groups in Serbia, that propaganda against the Austro-Hungarians be ceased, and that Austro-Hungary should have representation on the panel investigating the Archduke's assassination. The Austro-Hungarians had deliberately worded the ultimatum in such a way that the Serbians would find it impossible to agree to it. In fact, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador didn't expect Serbia to meet the demands at all and didn't stick around for a response. In fact, Serbia did make some concessions, but only in so much as they didn't threaten her sovereignty. Austro-Hungary's demand to intervene in the internal Serbian assassination investigation, however, was considered a step too far and was refused. At the same time, Serbia appealed to international opinion for support, citing the apparent concessions. However, the Serbian Prime Minister was convinced that Austro-Hungary was intending on a war. Russia also expected a war. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Sazonov, suspected that Germany had decided on provoking a preventative war against Russia in order to neutralise the threat of Russian rearmament. Russia's modernisation campaign for its military was due to finish in 1917. Accordingly, on the 24th of July, Russia began a partial mobilisation of some of its military to defend against any attack from Germany. Serbia mobilised its forces on the 25th in readiness for the expiry of the Austro-Hungarian ultimatum. Ironically, Austro-Hungary, which was driving the crisis, found itself in a position where it was pressurised by Germany to declare war ahead of mobilising its forces. It was these mobilisations that set in train, literally, the sequence of moves that were played out as if in a chess game. It was rail transport that drove the need for mobilisation. The need to deploy forces to the border by rail and the rigid logistics of rail timetables meant that in order to have enough forces in position to counter a threat, it was necessary to transport troops from their bases and muster points as quickly as possible. As troop movements looked the same for both offensive and defensive purposes, no nation could allow its neighbours to mass troops along a border without preparing its own troops to counter any offensive. It was therefore seen as impossible to break the cycle of mobilisation, with each subsequent move provoking a counter-move. Once countries began to mobilise, most of the players knew that war was inevitable. The small Balkan crisis was escalating out of control, and once mobilisation orders were given, it was a clear indication that war was much more likely. In reality, only Great Britain was exempt from the inexorable logic of mobilisation, protected as she was by the sea and the Royal Navy. She alone did not need to deploy a large continental army in a short time period to threaten borders. However, the fleet, having been massed for the annual review, was kept together on the initiative of a senior civil servant and then endorsed by the First Sea Lord, Winston Churchill, as an act of readiness. On the 25th of July, in the expectation that Austro-Hungary was planning to go to war, Serbia mobilised its army. At the same time, Franz Joseph ordered that Austro-Hungary mobilise on the 28th in preparation for an attack on Serbia. Fearful of the escalating situation, the British Foreign Minister, Sir Edward Grey, proposed to the Germans that a peace conference be called to try and avert the war. Grey also hardened his position. He'd been flirting with neutrality, but then made it clear that should any conflict develop from a localised Austro-Hungarian and Serbian affair, Britain would be unable to stand aside. Whilst he'd been toying with the idea of keeping Britain out of any conflict, and had certainly intimated this to the Germans, he was reminded that should Britain not stand by its allies, then Russia had the potential to make things very difficult over Britain's Indian commitments. Kaiser Wilhelm, returning from his yachting holiday on the 27th of July, was dismayed to hear of the increased risk that Britain may get involved. After all, Grey had told the ambassador that they were trying to stay out of any conflict. Realising that his High Command's calculations may be mistaken, he attempted to stop the Austro-Hungarians and start mediation. His assessment of the Serbian response to the ultimatum was that it was adequate, and this document does not in any way need for war. By this stage, however, Europe was closer to war, and Conrad was determined to go ahead with his personal war, and the Kaiser's Chancellor still believed that he could stop any conflict from spreading. In parallel to these moves, the French and Russian governments reinforced their commitment to each other and the need to stand firm, while France tried to convince Britain that she was still committed to peace. By reassuring Britain of their desire for peace, the French hoped to pave way for British support in the event of a war, which France herself was largely committed to. The agreements between Britain and France had deepened over the years, from a general understanding to a more strategic alliance under Sir Edward Grey, but Grey was adamant that Britain should retain freedom to act independently. However, towards the end of July, he went as far as to commit, and then rapidly withdraw, an offer to help France in the event of her remaining neutral in any conflict, effectively offering to guarantee her neutrality. In tandem with this, he rejected a suggestion from the Germans that they leave mainland France alone, but take her colonial territories. On the 28th of July, Austro-Hungary declared war on Serbia. The Austro-Hungarian army shelled Serbian targets across their border, and naval vessels in the Danube shelled Sarajevo itself. The Austro-Hungarian plan was to focus on Serbia and not to worry about the threat from Russia at this stage, based upon the faulty logic that Russia would take longer to mobilise than in reality she required. Remember, Russia had been in a pre-mobilisation stage for a little while now. The logic of mobilisation affected Germany perhaps more than any other nation. Ever fearful of the spectre of war on two fronts, and with both France and Russia as immediate and powerful enemies, war planning was predicated on the expected mobilisation timing of the protagonists. It was anticipated that France would mobilise fastest. Therefore, the German plan called for a short, sharp strike with the bulk of her forces to defeat the French. This action was to take about 5 weeks and would neutralise the threat to Germany's western borders. Then the German army would board trains and deploy to the east to face Russia. This plan was predicated on Russian forces failing to move against Germany in any strength during the early stages of the war. But it was acknowledged that it would be prudent to encourage Austro-Hungary to position some of her forces in the Galicia region. It was reasoned that this would divert the Russian focus from attacking eastern Prussia. As such, Germany pressurised Austro-Hungary not to focus solely on Serbia and to move its second army into Galicia. This was easier said, or demanded, than done. As a result of this change of direction, Austro-Hungary ended up with diluted forces on both fronts, as the structure of the Austro-Hungarian rail network meant that it could only really move its armies in one direction at a time. Having picked a war with Serbia, Austro-Hungary was now forced to denude the Serbian front in order to deploy to the Galician front. The absence of troops on the Serbian front meant that offensive action was dangerous. However, this was precisely the action that political pressure demanded. After all, what was the point of picking a fight with someone if only to defend once that fight had started? The key problem was manpower. Serbia could field around 350,000 troops, many of whom had had recent battle experience, whilst the Austro-Hungarians could field around 290,000 men, who were generally of lower calibre. The Austro-Hungarian commander, Oskar Potiorek, developed a plan that aimed to encircle firstly the Serbian forces and ultimately Serbia itself. However, depending as it did on manpower that was subsequently diverted to the Eastern Front, the plan was rapidly derailed. On the 31st of July, Britain asked both France and Germany to guarantee Belgian neutrality. The major powers of Europe, including Prussia as predecessor state to Germany, had each guaranteed that Belgium was to be preserved as a permanent neutral state when they signed the Treaty of London in 1839. Belgium, despite this guarantee, offered a tempting alternative to the heavily defended and often fought over Franco-German border. Unfortunately for Belgium, it presented a line of least resistance for both the Germans and the French if they wanted to strike at each other. It was this eventuality that the British sought to preempt by seeking reassurances from the French and the Germans that they would not use this option. Only the French were to respond. On the 1st of August, Tsar Nicholas, conscious of the escalating situation and keen to avoid a war, appealed to the Kaiser to avoid bloodshed. Later on that day, however, Kaiser Wilhelm determined to honour his commitments to Austro-Hungary and commanded full mobilisation of the German army. This was the last chance for peace in the east, and committed Germany to war with Russia. But first, the exposed Western Front must be neutralised. Efforts in the German camp were now focused on the role of Britain and France. The German ambassador in London, Lichnowsky, sent a last-minute message to Berlin in which he expressed his belief that he had been offered a British guarantee that France would remain neutral if Germany was willing to undertake not to attack. However, this offer was based on a misunderstanding between Lichnowsky and Sir Edward Grey and was never a real option. Nevertheless, it excited the Kaiser as he clutched at the hope that he could save himself from a two-front war. Wilhelm immediately ordered that the German army's opening moves in the updated Schlieffen Plan be halted to allow this late plan for peace in the West to develop. Von Moltke, however, in charge of the plan, was adamant that his forces could not possibly be transferred to fight Russia in the East when the plan committed them first to crushing France. He stressed that any deviation to the plan could leave German forces in disarray and still facing potential French aggression. At 11 p.m. on the 1st of August, German troops at Trier were ordered to begin their move over the border into Luxembourg, whose independence was also guaranteed under the Treaty of London, in order to take control of a strategic rail and telegraph junction. As the troops moved over the border, King George V attempted to intervene by sending a telegram to the Tsar, urging restraint, but like Sir Edward Grey's final futile telegram to Berlin, it arrived too late. As these last diplomatic moves were playing themselves out, Germany, already committed to war, presented the Russian Minister for Foreign Affairs, Sazonov, with a formal declaration of war. In an emotional meeting, Sazonov turned on the German ambassador and told him that the curses of the nations will be upon you. He continued, "You could have prevented the war by one word. You didn't want to." The German ambassador had to be helped from the room in tears. On the 2nd of August, German troops crossed the border with France for the first time, and a number of small skirmishes broke out. In Britain, the Royal Navy was issued with a full mobilisation order. At 7 o'clock on the evening of the 2nd, the Germans issued an ultimatum to the Belgian government demanding free and safe passage across Belgian territory. The deadline set for the response was just 12 hours. The Belgians refused the ultimatum, citing the guarantees of the Treaty of London in 1839, and resolved to defend their country. With the expiration of the ultimatum to Belgium on August the 3rd, Germany declared war on France and sent troops across the Belgian border in order to prepare for an attack on the French from the north. In the Reichstag, the German Chancellor, Bethmann Hollweg, acknowledged that German troops were in Belgium, stating that "the wrong, I speak openly, that we are committing, we will endeavour to make good as soon as our military goal is reached." In line with her treaty obligations, Britain sent an ultimatum to Germany demanding that Belgian neutrality be respected. For those in the British government who wanted war against Germany, Belgium presented a perfect casus belli, or a justification for war, untarnished with ulterior motives. They were to get their wish, and at 11 p.m. on the 4th of August, Britain's ultimatum expired and war was formally declared. In a little over a month, the great powers of Germany, France, Great Britain, Russia and Austro-Hungary had gone from peace to being at war with each other. They would remain at war for over 4 more years. Hope you've enjoyed that podcast from 1914 to 1918 war.com. As I said at the top, this is a massive subject and I've glossed over a whole bunch of details. For example, did you know that all of the ultimatums were written in French, as that was the language of diplomacy at the time? If you've enjoyed this, please leave a review, say something nice, and make sure that you're subscribed so that you get future episodes. Thanks for listening.